Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me to share what I learned about the Sulpicians and slavery. I'm going to give you a PowerPoint presentation that basically has 3 points. I'm going to talk about why I got involved in the research that I did, and secondly, to talk about 3 of the findings, and then to talk about offer some personal reflections that might help to stimulate conversation.
Yes.
Let me start off with my motivation for doing this particular research. I had personal motivation because when I took a sabbatical in 2015-16 to recover from being provincial for a while, I decided to write a biography of Father Francois Charles Nagot. He was the first Sulpician leader in the US and the first superior of what is today St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore. Here's a picture of the cover of a little book that I published for the Sulpicians. I had long admired Father Nagot for his missionary zeal and personal holiness, but nobody had ever done a thorough study of his life. This is an oil painting of Father Nagot that gives you a better picture of what he looked like. During my research, I learned that he and the 5 other Sulpicians who came to the US in the early 1790s soon became entangled to different degrees with slavery in this country. This awakened my interest in that topic, and it raised an important question in my mind, which was, why would a priest that was so outstanding as Father Nagot allow himself to get involved with such an oppressive institution? So I had that personal motivation before I started my research. And then there was a second and more immediate reason for my study, and that is right after my biography was published, Father John Kemper, who was my provincial and has since died, invited me to study the topic and perhaps to publish something on it. And this is a picture of Father John Kemper. Some of you may know him. John asked me to do this for 2 reasons. First of all, he was aware of the fact that a number of scholars were studying the relationship between early American institutions and slavery. And these institutions included Catholic institutions like Georgetown, as Father Kosicki said. And second, he also knew that several historians had pointed to one or another of the early Sulpicians as an owner of slaves or as someone who mistreated slaves. I can share, so Father Kemper really wanted to know what was the truth. In other words, what was the extent of the involvement of our community in slavery in those early days. And I published my results or my findings in the US Catholic Historian. And of course, I can't review all those findings here, but I'd like to just highlight 3 of them and then make some comments that you might find useful. At least they're from perspective of a white priest, retired white priest. First of all, I learned that the early Sulpicians were culturally predisposed to accept or at least tolerate the institution of slavery on this side of the Atlantic. During the Ancien regime in France proper, there was no institution of slavery. Nevertheless, it was the backbone of the economy in the French colonies in the New World. And this colored etching, I think, illustrates that very well. It shows the slaves working on sugarcane, a very, very difficult, backbreaking kind of work, and the overseer or the owner sitting in the shade under the tree watching what was going on. Well, it's important to realize that what sugarcane was for the French colonies in the Caribbean, tobacco was for the British colonies in the middle Atlantic region, particularly Virginia and Maryland. And this old illustration shows a tobacco plantation, probably in Maryland or Virginia, with the enslaved workers working in the tobacco field, picking the leaves, preparing them to be dried, while the owner or overseer is sitting in the shade watching everything go on. I also learned that France was the third most important slave trading country in the world in the 18th century. So I think that every well-educated French priest would have been aware of these facts and would also have known the various opinions about how Catholic teaching on slavery should be applied to the already existing slave system in the New World. Along these lines, I also found out that two of the earliest Sulpicians grew up in places in France that had close economic ties to the French Caribbean. The first of these was Ambrose Mareschal, who later became the Archbishop of Baltimore. And here's a portrait of Mareschal when he was Archbishop. He was the son of a successful merchant in a suburb of Orléans, France. And Orléans had strong commercial ties to the colonial sugar trade. I think I can illustrate how that was by showing you a map of France. Paris, of course, is represented by the red star. And Orléans, which was the birthplace of Mareschal, is right there south of Paris. But it's important also to know that Nantes, which was the leading port in the French slave trade, was located there. And between the two of them was the Loire River. So when the raw sugar was shipped back from the French Caribbean to Nantes, it was taken upriver to Orléans to be refined and distributed throughout France and also much of Western Europe. The second early Sulpician who had ties with the French Caribbean, even stronger ties, was William Louis Dubourg, using the English translations of their names. Dubourg was the founder of the Sulpician College in Baltimore and also the first American bishop of the Louisiana Territory. This is a portrait of Dubourg as bishop. He was the son of a prominent French planter in Haiti. Moreover, he was raised in Bordeaux, France, which was the second most important hub of the French slave trade. Again, here's a map of France showing Nantes, the first hub, and Bordeaux at the end of the second arrow there, which was the second most important hub of the French slave trade. So based on this, I think it's quite fair to say that the first Sulpicians would have known what was going on in the French colonies and would have been culturally predisposed to accept or at least tolerate slavery on this side of the Atlantic. Obviously, there was no slavery in France proper, but it was quite a different story in the French colonies. The second finding that I'd like to share with you this afternoon is that I was able to learn why, at least in their own minds, the early Sulpicians became involved with slavery. It's clear from the records that they were motivated by two practical concerns. Oops. First, and most importantly, the French Revolution, the ongoing revolution, had cut them off from their chief source of funding in Paris. And during the 1790s, the new seminary that they founded in Baltimore had very few students. So there wasn't much income coming in to pay the bills. This is a picture of the seminary in 1791. They purchased it. It had originally been a tavern outside of the town of Baltimore. So in 1793, the seed money that they brought with them ran out, And it was then that they turned to renting or borrowing enslaved workers as a way of reducing operating expenses and helping to keep the seminary alive. Here is the evidence of that as found in the minutes of a meeting on August 20th, 1793. It says, "We decided to have come from Bohemia," and I'll explain that in a minute, "a black man and a black woman to serve in the seminary and to cut down as far as possible the number of white domestics who are very expensive because of the salaries which are excessive in this country." So they were certainly critical of the what they considered to be excessive salaries, but they didn't raise any critical question about their proposed solution. Now for the connection with Bohemia. At this exact time, Bishop John Carroll came to their rescue. He arranged for the Sulpicians to take over the management of Bohemia Plantation, which was one of the big farms owned by the Jesuits, the former Jesuits, because the society was suppressed at that particular time in history. And that plantation had about 50 farm workers attached to it. The young Ambrose Marischal was put in charge there in late 1793. For those of you who don't know the geography of Maryland, this is a map, obviously, of the state. Here, and Delaware is to the right, Virginia to the left. The red square is Baltimore, where the original seminary was, and Bohemia Plantation was located up in the northeast corner of Maryland, not far from Delaware or the Pennsylvania border. It was about less than a day's trip from Baltimore to Bohemia. While Marischal was there, he completed work on the new chapel, because Bohemia was a mission of the Jesuits, and they had missions usually connected with their large farms. The church that Father Marischal helped to finish it still exists up there at Bohemia at this point. Under Sulpician management, Bohemia didn't generate much income for the seminary, but it did serve as a source of enslaved workers who from time to time were sent to assist at the seminary. All that ended about 6 years later in 1799, when the former Jesuits took their farm and slaves back in order to support their own struggling Georgetown College. So economic pressures were certainly the first reason why the early members of my community began to use enslaved workers at their new seminary in the 1790s. I also found another practical reason, perhaps even less edifying one, for their use of enslaved laborers. Again, this comes from the same meeting, the minutes of August 20th, 1793. They said, "We again asked about the domestics. We again talked about the domestics who were all speaking of leaving, some for one reason, others for another. On the subject, someone said that it was scarcely possible in this country to find good domestics who would be stable and become attached to the house. So the surest way would be to get black domestics, the best we could acquire, because slaves do not have the freedom of seeking work elsewhere. Thus, we would be sure of keeping them, and they could be trained to do the work of our white domestics." The third and last finding that I'd like to share this afternoon is that the early Sulpicians not only rented and borrowed enslaved laborers, but they also owned a few later on at 2 locations in Maryland. First, there's evidence that in the early 19th century, there were at least 3 slaves who belonged to the Sulpicians on the Baltimore campus. This is a picture of the Baltimore campus about 1820. You can see the chapel in the middle of the picture, with the seminary being the small red building in front of the chapel, and the college, which was much larger, being to the left of the chapel. You can see that the grounds were very well organized, as you would expect from a group of French priests. Well, so I'm saying that the research showed that there were at least three slaves on this property that were owned by the Sulpicians. Dubourg bought one of them in Cuba just before he became president of the Sulpician College in 1800. In 1808, he gave a slave, perhaps the same one, to Sulpician Benedict Flaget when he left Baltimore to go to Kentucky to serve as the first bishop there. And there's Benedict Flaget. The other two slaves belonged to Father John Tessier while he was superior in Baltimore from 1810 to 1829. And here's a portrait of Father Tessier. Tessier had inherited the first person, an enslaved woman named Marie Madeleine Georgette, in 1818, and he freed her in 1826. We don't know anything more about the second individual, a boy named Basil, whom Tessier purchased in 1819. Since all the property of the seminary was titled in the name of the superior back then, it's very likely that these enslaved workers actually belonged to the Sulpician community and weren't Tessier's personal servants. The last evidence of the presence of slaves at the Baltimore Seminary is from the census, the federal census of 1840. Here's an illustration of what the campus looked like at that time. And again, you see the chapel in the middle with the college on the left, but the seminary now is a much larger structure because by that time it had become quite successful. The evidence from the census says that there were still 2 elderly slaves in residence there, but the record doesn't say whether these 2 people were owned by the seminary or not. The census materials did not include that detail at that early. There's also evidence that the Sulpicians in Maryland owned some enslaved workers at a second location. In 1807, an immigrant priest named Jean Dubois joined the Sulpicians. And here's a portrait of Dubois when he was the 3rd Bishop of New York. When he joined, he already owned a few personal slaves. He also owned a small piece of land in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and he donated that land to the Sulpicians so that they could move their small new minor seminary program to that location. Again, here's a map of Maryland with Baltimore in red, and the second seminary that the Sulpicians founded was located up in northwest of Baltimore near the Pennsylvania line. Nagot appointed Dubois as the first superior of this new campus in 1809. Before the institution opened, however, and to provide a kind of endowment for it along European lines, Dubourg represented the Sulpicians in the purchase of a nearby farm, along with a group of enslaved farm workers that were attached to it. So the Mount, as it was already called back then, at the Mount, Dubois, on behalf of the Sulpicians, owned perhaps 10 enslaved laborers. He probably rented others, as was customary at that time in northern Maryland. And in 1826, the seminary in Emmitsburg became independent of the Sulpicians, but the enslaved laborers remained up there at Emmitsburg at the Mount. Here's a sketch of the Mount from 1822. And you'll notice with here the caption that was typed in later doesn't mention anything about slave quarters. But the archivist at Mount St. Mary's University and Seminary supplied me with a picture, a very old picture of a slave cabin up there from the 19th century. So in essence, that is the truth about the early Sulpicians in Maryland. And what I would like to do now is to draw some conclusions and offer some reflections on on that truth. I have three sets of reflections. First of all, I believe that the early Sulpicians in Maryland were uncritical about this aspect of their enculturation into this country. You notice they were critical about other things. They were critical about the salaries of employees. They were critical about sometimes about the food or the lack of good wine that they could find and so forth and so on. But they were uncritical about, I think, this aspect of their lives. The culture that they entered was the culture of Maryland. And Maryland was not just a state that had slaves in it, it was a true slave society in the 18th century. This meant that the entire economy and the broader culture were shaped by the institution of slavery. Even though the American Revolution had recently disrupted the tobacco plantation system in Maryland, when the first Sulpicians arrived in Baltimore, slaves still made up a third of Maryland's population and a significant portion of the available workforce in Northern Maryland. Moreover, and Father Tim Kosicki has already touched on this very well, in colonial Maryland, the leaders of the church, which were the Jesuits, had relied on enslaved farm workers on their various large farms or plantations to support their ministry. When the Sulpicians arrived, the Jesuits had been canonically suppressed in Maryland, but there was an organization of priests that consisted of former members of the Jesuits, and they still owned several plantations with hundreds of slaves working on them. Bishop Carroll, himself a former Jesuit, owned a personal slave. So the question is, how do I process this kind of inadequate and uncritical enculturation of the early Sulpicians? On the one hand, I don't believe in judging figures from the distant past according to today's standards. On the other hand, I'd found no evidence that the early Sulpicians expressed moral reservations about accepting or at least tolerating Maryland's flawed economic system. Now, I admit that finding no evidence is not in itself evidence, and it may be relevant that these early Sulpicians employed only free laborers at the beginning. Nevertheless, when they turned to enslaved laborers in 1793, they had no discussion of any of the evils of slavery. And this affected, in my mind, the kind of overly idealistic image that I had of them. Now I think I see them as more human, as men with gifts, but also men that had a very, very serious limitations. This raises my second set of comments, which is concerning their memorials to them that we have. We don't have many, but we do have a few. Would I be in favor of eliminating them or playing them down? I don't think I am. Let me explain why. First, these French priests made very important contributions to the early development of the church in this country. They founded the first two Catholic seminaries and the first Catholic college that achieved success. Georgetown was a little later in becoming as successful as the Sulpician College in Baltimore. They served as missionaries to many distant parts of the country and also as some of our nation's first bishops. Second, and this was alluded to by Brother Ernest, they advanced the education of Black Catholics during the early Republic. It was Dubourg who in 1795 started a program of religious instruction for Black Catholics in Baltimore. And these Catholics were mixed. Some were free and others were enslaved. Most of them had come to Baltimore as a result of the Haitian Revolution to escape the violence there, or they were brought to Baltimore by their slave owners when the owners tried to escape the Haitian Revolution. And when Dubourg was named president of Georgetown a year later, Tessier took over the program and ran it for almost 30 years, while he also served as the de facto pastor of Black Catholics in Baltimore. But it's interesting, one historian has noted, and I think this fits the pattern, that Tessier recognized the spiritual equality of Black Catholics, but he didn't seem to see that this had significant social and economic consequences. Nevertheless, many people did benefit greatly from his ministry of teaching and his wider ministry. And of course, I could name Mother Mary Lang and some of her companions. She was the foundress, as you know, of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. As an aside, I think that Dubourg and Tessier were committed to the religious education of the enslaved because that they were French Catholics. Even the reviled French Code Noir, or law of slavery, required that slave owners allow their slaves to get religious instruction and have access to the sacraments of the church. That made the official or the formal French approach to slavery different from the more secular British approach. So I continue to have great respect for these early Sulpicians because of their pioneering accomplishments and their spirit, their missionary spirit, despite their apparent blindness about slavery. I look at them something like the way I look at the founding fathers of our nation, who are much more deeply involved in slavery than these early Sulpicians were. Third and finally, how have today's Sulpicians responded to what I turned up, what I dug up? And this, of course, raises the issue that came up earlier, the issue of reparations, as it's sometimes called. From what I was able to determine, in this case, in the case of the Sulpicians, it seems to me that it would be virtually impossible to identify these enslaved workers or their descendants, to find out who they were. They're only some of them are not referred to by name at all, and the ones that are referred to by name are only referred to by their first name. And also, we don't know who some of those were that the Sulpicians borrowed or rented. It would also be virtually impossible, in my mind, to quantify responsibility for the damage done to these enslaved people when they were under Sulpician management or Sulpician control. So as a moral theologian, I'm reminded that when literal restitution for injustice is morally impossible, some equivalent is still required. And along these lines, the leadership of my community, shortly after my article was finished, decided to double down on the more positive side of our heritage. They increased their longstanding financial support for the education of young African Americans in Baltimore City. We've only just started reflecting on this because we were planning to have this as one of the themes of our convocation this past spring, so that all the members could begin to discuss this and own the truth of our history. But of course, COVID-19 made our convocation impossible. I think myself that this was a good start to taking seriously our history and the history of the church in this country. In recent weeks, the press has been covering Black Lives Matter in a way that I think is focused a lot on the past, on the appropriateness of honoring certain historical figures, or on the need to revise or rebalance the way American history is taught. Nevertheless, I believe that Black Lives Matter is even more concerned about the future What's needed above all is social and economic change that promotes equality and justice. For this reason, I think that the recent decision of my community was a good one, because a solid primary and secondary education can open a lot of doors to a better future. I hope that in the future, our community will struggle with this even more and try to come to terms further with the implications of this for our life today. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.